There are a variety of different agreements between firms and parent companies. So this is really where the trafficking idea comes in the sense that people agree to things that they don't necessarily fully understand. This presents a challenge to maintaining the digital sovereignty of the United States, as well as offers China an opportunity to gather a lot of valuable data about users around the world.
Welcome to Tokyo Talk. I'm Patrick McGeckran. I'm delighted to be joined today with old friend and colleague Aynne Kokas, who's a C.K. Yen professor at the Miller Center and professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. Aynne has a long and distinguished resume, including being non-resident scholar at Rice University's Baker Institute of Public Policy, a life member at the Council on Foreign Relations, a fellow in the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations Public Intellectuals Program, and a variety of other distinguished fellowships. She's also testified before both houses of Congress, is a frequent commentator in the media, and most importantly for our purposes today, author of a great new book called Trafficking Data, How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty, which is now available in Japanese, and you can find the links to it in the description below. Welcome, Aynne.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, Patrick.
Okay, so Aynne, let's start first with the big picture. So your book, Trafficking Data, I think our viewers will understand how, when we download an app where we're giving some of our data away to those companies, but your book tells a story about how those companies will then transfer some of this data across national boundaries, getting the trafficking term. Can you give us an example of what this looks like and what is trafficking data?
Yeah, so when we think about trafficking data, so many of us have downloaded apps and then gone through and agreed to the terms of service and not necessarily read them. I teach a class called The Data Ethics of TikTok at the University of Virginia, and for many students, that's the first time that they ever have read a terms of service for any app that they have ever used. So there are a variety of different agreements between firms and their parent companies to be able to share data both with parent companies as well as with third parties. And part of the challenge that we face in a US context is that there's very little, there are very few constraints over how that data can be shared with other companies and also with parent companies. And so this is really where the trafficking idea comes in the sense that people agree to things that they don't necessarily fully understand. And I argue that this presents a challenge to maintaining the digital sovereignty of the United States, as well as offers China an opportunity to gather a lot of valuable data about users around the world.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. But what exactly is digital sovereignty then?
That's a great question. So digital sovereignty is this idea of the relationship between the data that a country gathers and also the ability of that country to manage that data. And one thing that's distinctive about the United States is that we have a much more fluid vision of what constitutes digital sovereignty than a country like China does. In China, it's called cyber sovereignty, and it includes any data that's gathered about Chinese citizens by Chinese companies or by the Chinese government globally. So when we see those two things interact, what that means is that there are a lot of expectations by the Chinese government for the type of data that they can gather in the United States about Americans through Chinese firms.
Okay, well that's a great overview. So let's maybe break it down, maybe step by step. So that first step of the harvesting data, you've got this great anecdote about how companies in bankruptcy proceedings even can sell data. So it's very clear that this data has monetary value. So how are companies making money off of our data? Are they simply being able to market things more effectively to us, or is there another element at play?
So there are a wide variety of different uses, and I won't be able to get into all of them right now, but to your point, one key area is targeting ads more effectively. Another is being able to develop new products and services. So for example, we saw the rise of DeepSeek, which relies heavily on a wide swath of user data to be able to develop this new highly valuable product. So when we think about data, it's not just about targeting a specific product, or when you find out that you talk on your phone, and then all of a sudden you find out a new ad for shoes, though that is valuable and it's really useful for specific companies to be able to leverage that. There's also the experience of being able to develop these really valuable new products and services.
So wouldn't companies want to sort of keep that data then, that asset to themselves? I mean, are they selling it to companies in other countries like China? Are they being forced into the situation of giving it? What's the story there?
So companies around the world do have this ability to sell the data that they gather because it's so valuable. And also they can transfer that data to their parent companies that can then use it in other ways that might not be the same as the app that we initially used. So for example, WeChat is an app that gathers a large amount of user data through communications platforms. And it's a centerpiece of communication between the United States and China. WeChat's parent company, Tencent, is also a Chinese military contractor. And so there's the communication data that WeChat is gathering, but then there's also the ways in which it can be leveraged in other ways by its parent company. And this applies, I talk about a lot of different apps and platforms in my book.
So, as an individual, why would someone be concerned about their data being, spread amongst a variety of different companies? I think you tell the example of the Grindr app, for example.
Right.
Maybe explain that to us a little bit. How is it that, are they learning more about us and, types of kittens that we like on different social media platforms?
Yeah, so in the case of Grindr, Grindr is an LGBTQ IA plus social media app that was designed for dating and socializing, and gathered data about people's HIV status, for example, other types of health information. So that was a kind of key area of interest, and the Grindr data was then shared with Chinese government's own servers. Now, there's an interesting intersection here, because one of the things that I argue in the book, and when I talk with people, is most people's data isn't that interesting. Now, Patrick, your data as a US diplomat, it might be more interesting, but most individuals' data isn't that interesting. However, when it can be combined with larger scale data gathering, like for example, the Office of Personnel Management hack, so getting information about individuals as well as key information about their personal lives or likes or interests, that can become interesting for foreign countries from an intelligence gathering standpoint. That being said, there are also other key areas. I talk about biodata gathering in the book as well, which can be used both for the development of precision medicine, so targeting cures, as well as bioweapons. So it's not just about the social media story. There are other really big implications.
Okay, so we're talking about more than the development of the Chinese economic ecosystem trying to help Chinese state-owned enterprises, but there's really a core national security element at play here.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. And so you've written about and spoken about the asymmetrical nature of the regulatory environments in the United States and China in particular. So the United States has a relatively, and correct me if I'm wrong or for mischaracterizing your argument, but laissez-faire approach to national level regulation on a lot of this data. The Chinese have regulations that incentivize companies to provide this data to them, and so it should be sort of as no surprise as to which direction the data is flowing. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that I'd like to add to that is that for personal data protection, so the data protection for individuals, the Chinese laws are actually much more in line with European laws than US laws are. And this creates an interesting tension between the US and European partners, and because US data protection for individuals is quite limited. Now, in the context of government data oversight, the European Union and China are quite different. So it's not that there's a total consistency, but there is definitely fragmentation.
So catch us up a little bit. For those that follow the tech space, they'll know very well about the EU's laws with respect to privacy and data protection. But share with us a little bit of how the U.S. and Europe sort of differ, how Europe provides an alternative approach to regulating data.
Yeah, so the difference between the United States and the European Union, and actually the United States and Japan in a lot of ways as well, is the use of something called the precautionary principle versus risk-based decision-making. So in the US, there's a philosophy that includes basically trying things out in a market and then regulating if there are problems. In a European context or a Japanese context, or actually in a Chinese context when talking about personal data protection, there is an effort to try to protect consumers in advance of those issues emerging. And so this is a fundamental dissonance in terms of how the US regulates with a lot of its allies and partners. And this isn't just in the tech space, by the way. It also applies in, for example, the pharmaceutical industry or in bioengineered food and other types of areas.
I see. Let me ask you about DeepSeek. This was the Chinese tech startup that's been around for a few years, but really made big splash last month when their R1 model came out. Was trying to say that some were saying that it was rivaling OpenAI's ChatGPT at a fraction of the cost. But now the DeepSeek app, several states have said that we can't the citizens of those states can't download it. South Korea has banned the download. The House has introduced legislation to ban the download of this app to U.S. government phones because the concern that the Chinese government is collecting data from this. Is this sort of part of the same story of what you write about in Trafficking Data, just sort of cutting out the middleman of the Chinese basically going direct to consumer to take our data?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think anyone who uses DeepSeek should know is that the data gathered by DeepSeek, so anytime you put in a query, for example, that data is stored in China. And that's part of the terms of service. Some of you may not have read the terms of service, so you may not know that, so I like to share that information. The other thing that I think is valuable to understand, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, is the ways in which the gathering of data from multiple companies actually benefits the development of the Chinese information ecosystem and tech ecosystem. So for example, South Korea recently found that DeepSeek was sharing, or that ByteDance was sharing data with DeepSeek. ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok. So when we see the relationship between these firms, and that also enhances the ability to be able to develop these new highly emergent industries.
Now, why would two separate Chinese companies have an interest in sharing this sort of data? Is there something coordinated going on from the Chinese government that's forcing that coordination? Or is it market principles at work?
Well, it's interesting. And so all that I know at this point is that the coordination was found. I can talk about the larger Chinese government pressures that these firms might face, though. So for example, in China, there's something called civil military fusion, which essentially requires that any products or services that are developed by Chinese firms be used for military or state purposes. So this can force coordination between firms. The other thing that's important to note is that for firms like ByteDance and like DeepSeek that depend on the continued access to the Chinese market for their very existence, the Cyberspace Administration of China and other Chinese government organizations have a huge amount of leverage in terms of the different ways that they can pressure those organizations, both legally and illegally, or extra legally.
So any company, even American company, multinational firm that also has a presence in China would be subject to those sorts of pressures, presumably?
Indeed, they would, yes.
Okay. And so we're here in Japan. Much of our audience is Japanese. And I think much of the story that we've talked about has been a U.S.-China story so far. But I know some of your exciting follow-on research is directly related to some of our allies here in the region, including the Japanese. So bring this home to the Japanese viewers for us. I know that research is still in the formative stage, but what can you share with our viewers about how it affects them?
So a couple of things that I think are really important to note are, first of all, the value of Japan's personal information protection laws, because a lot of the pressures that the US faces in terms of the gathering of user data by Chinese firms, Japan does not face those same pressures in quite the same way, in the sense that there are existing personal information protection laws that protect the data of Japanese citizens from being taken out, from being trafficked out of Japan. That doesn't mean it's an impossibility, but it does mean that there are legal mechanisms in place that help to protect the data of Japanese citizens. And so that's something I think is really an interesting distinction, and something that the US can learn from Japan in terms of its relationship to China and relationship to the Chinese tech sector.
And so the United States then, is it fair to say is fairly unique, at least maybe among the G7 countries, as citizens of a major economy that don't have these sorts of protections on their data flowing to China?
Indeed. The United States is quite unique in the G7, and this is a tension between a lot of our allies and partners. It also creates an interesting dynamic within the US where there are significant commercial interests that benefit from not having data protections for user data, because as we mentioned before, it's very enriching for companies. You can sell it off in bankruptcy protection, you can develop new products and services. So firms don't actually have a lot of incentive to advocate for more personal data protection. And one of the arguments that friends and colleagues in Japan and the European Union have made is that they're able to develop these personal information protections because they don't have as many large tech companies that are advocating against them.
So I don't mean to put you on the spot with a question like this, because I know you're an analyst, you're looking through the situation, but sort of looking forward, what would be your policy recommendations about how to address some of these concerns?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think, as someone who has loved, living in Japan and studying Japanese, I would love to see more learning and sharing between the United States and other G7 countries on different ways to develop digital rights principles that are shared among the G7 countries. Because I think that's really important for countering the growth of the Chinese tech sector, because if, for example, data from the United States can flow more easily to China, that does create a significant strategic challenge, not just for the United States, but also for our allies and partners.
Absolutely. And when we have shared national security interests, that certainly goes hand in hand, it seems.
Indeed.
Wonderful. So Anne, how were you able to do this research?
So Patrick, I have to tell you, I would not have been able to complete this research without the support of the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, which is actually where we met.
That's right.
And that's why we're here talking today.
That's right.
It's really exciting. As well as the Abe Fellowship, which helped to support the existence of the Japanese version. And my ability to even speak Chinese and do research in China is because of the Title VI funding from the US government, as well as Fulbright funding. So really, this is the project of a lot of people and a lot of time invested in this type of scholarship. And so I'm very grateful to be here at the Department of State, and thanks for all the support.
All amazing programs and obviously a great investment. Well, Anne, thank you so much for taking the time with us. It was wonderful to talk to you as always.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to see you, Patrick.